coming in on Teams today from Wadawurrung Country, and we would like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So we're in Geelong or Djilang, for anyone who doesn't know Wadawurrung Country. So from the expanded field to a feasibility study on temporary public art commissioning and its outcomes is a reflective case study on delivering government-funded outcomes for experimental temporary public art commissioning in regional Victoria. In 2020, Expanded Field was funded by the City of Greater Geelong through their Arts Industry Commissions program and deployed across a number of civic sites in the Victorian Regional Centre of Geelong on Wadawurrung Country. So in this paper, project curator Ilana Russell and myself as an invited artist reflect on the value of the Artist Lab as both a commissioning framework and a performative public art outcome through the delivery of both Expanded Field, the Artist Laboratory, and Feasibility Study, a work of experimental publishing. And herein we follow Donna Haraway and Karen Berard's writing on the use of diffractive methodologies, and we explore how through works of this kind, artists, curators and councils might collaborate on the presentation of temporary public art for multiple publics.
Expanded Field was positioned as an experimental inquiry into the public and civic spaces of Geelong. Devised as an urban laboratory, it provided an invitational framework for two artists, Sarah Jones and Sarah Walker, to embed themselves in place to interrogate sight from within. 4 locally based facilitators were engaged to offer provocations to the artists through a series of staged explorations of the city. Architect Jose Rodriguez walked us through the CBD, drawing our attention to the partially obscured relics of streets and laneways. We met artist and writer Pip Murray at her home in Finesford, and through art historical accounts, we explored the myths of the Australian Gothic. Steve Rull, a Tanarong artist who grew up in Geelong, took us on a phenomenological tour through his past, a literal stroll down memory lane. And acoustic ecologist Vicky Hallett encouraged us to listen, to walk the city centre with our eyes to the ground. As well as fostering connections between artists, sites and publics, a key aim of the lab was to engage the Geelong Council in conversations about what public art could be in the context of temporary and permanent commissions. As the city is undertaking significant development projects, including the recent completion of a civic precinct, it was critical for artists to have agency to engage in a dialogue with and pose questions to the city. At the close of the formal lab program, both Sarah's and myself met to discuss possible public outcomes that might satisfy the council brief for an arts industry commission. The first, and within a council reporting context, the least tangible outcome of Expanded Field, was the formation of The Contemporary, a responsive, local and experimental collective made up of researchers, curators, artists, and first and foremost, local citizens. In the conversations that followed as The Contemporary, it soon emerged the sense that the work had already been made and performed. The civic intervention was the Expanded Field Lab, with artists and provocateurs collaborating on shifting perspectives, expanded understandings, and imagined alternate possibilities for interactions with public space and the city. Expanded Field was successful to the degree that the ends were in fact also the means.
Donna Haraway and Karen Berard describe their diffractive methodology. Berard writes, "It is a method of diffractively reading insights through one another, building new insights and attentively and carefully reading for differences that matter in their finer details. Together with the recognition that there, intrinsic to this analysis, is an ethics not predicated on externality, but rather entanglement. Diffractive readings bring inventive provocations. They are good to think with." And Melanie Segal explains that as a method, diffraction incorporates historicity and difference into the practice of theory itself, and in its emphasis on effect is essentially pragmatic. Segal uses the metaphor of dropping stones in water, observing that the pattern generated by 2 stones dropping into water is both the effect and the result of the event, the difference and the consequences it induces. Diffraction's patterns are, according to Segal, not classificatory but performative, and following Haraway can be understood as a technology for making consequential meanings. We can attribute the success of Expanded Field to its diffractive methodology. The investigative mode accounts for the project as the performance and therein the outcome. These outcomes will continue to be generative, site responsive, and may always remain independent from the logistics of the realisation of what is generally understood as public art. But in a diffractive methodology, there is always the opportunity for more complex interruptions, more patterns, and more stones. And so within the constraints of a publicly funded project, what could it look like to account for these kinds of outcomes, to practically acquit them, for example, considering the financial backing and expectation of local government? Had the project been successful from the outside? And this remains a subject of debate for the contemporary, prompting us to ask, how might the effects of expanded field as temporary public art outcome expand? In the case of a dialogical project such as this one, we thought more voices, more invitations to collaborate, and imagine more civic participation. All we needed following the lab's methodology was an expansion of the field toward the collection and entanglement of more differences. So we set about recording our collective lab experience. Memories, quotes, questions, and dialogical accounts were collated and edited as a series of text fragments. We imagined that these fragments could be printed in large, reflective vinyl and installed in corresponding public sites throughout Geelong city centre. The work, as an experiment in publishing, would be a somewhat poetic provocation addressed to a multiplicity of publics, locals, tourists, vendors, shoppers, architectures, to the whole complex landscape designated as the site for public art. Michael Warner, in his seminal work, Publics and Counterpublics, explores three types of public. He writes, "The public is a kind of social totality. In its most common sense is that of people in general. A public can also be a second thing, a concrete audience, a crowd witnessing itself in visible space. Such a public also has a sense of totality, bounded by the event or the shared physical space. In its third sense, for Warner, there is the kind of public that comes into being only in relation to texts and their circulation, like the public of the essay. This public unites strangers through participation alone, at least in theory." And so we wanted to devise an artwork that could address all three of Warner's publics, framed in the field of public art as a site-specific temporary public address through a non-traditional publishing form, a work of publishing as process. That would be exemplary of expanded field's form, in which the entire civic landscape would be reimagined as a conversational publication. We compiled the final list of text fragments to be printed alongside their suggested locations, and we sent them to the council's public art team, who received them without comment or feedback.
In the summer of January 2022, the Contemporary began installing these texts throughout the city under the title of Feasibility Study. We began at the Geelong Town Hall, carefully unfurling 8.3 metres of text across the forecourt. Running along the channels in the concrete at the foot of the stairs between the fours of two lions, we installed a question. When people like you congregate, is it a gathering or a threat? The work was removed that afternoon. Weeks later, we installed another text, this one destined for Market Square. For those not familiar with Geelong City, Market Square has long been the problem child of our regional centre. Fiona Gray, in her essay, Zombie Urbanism and the City by the Bay, frames Market Square as an area that has been problematic for the city's leaders since the 1840s, an urban form designed as a way of insulating the city from itself, which turned public space into a semi-private realm based on consumption, commodification and profit. We traipsed through the bus interchange with our boxes of vinyl. The streets was buzzing with after-school commuters, parents and shoppers. Sheltered around the corner from the interchange on Little Mallup Street was an enormous blank wall, yet another of Market Square's boarded up retail windows. It was the blank canvas we couldn't resist. As we struggled with 7.3 metres of plastic-backed vinyl in the wind, a group of adolescents milled around, smoking, laughing, spitting, yelling, not so much waiting for a bus as just waiting for something to happen. We unfurled our next text. When you stand still, is it loitering, lingering, or leisure?
Oi, what's loitering?
The question, thinly veiled in teen bravado, was genuine. We explained to stand around without apparent purpose and posed the question back, loitering, lingering, or leisure. The boys smiled broadly, laughed and yelled back, definitely loitering. It was a spectacular moment for temporary public art, for the broader engagement of the much lamented non-art audience so often identified in funding applications. The work was removed that afternoon. This time, the removal was accompanied by a request from Council for the Contemporary to issue an apology to the city's most problematic commercial tenant, lest the text jeopardise our working relationship with Market Square.
What would provoke the funder to decommission a work before it had been seen by its intended audience? What had the Council read in these questions? Had they imagined that these questions were directed at the decision makers who congregate between the lions or in the bus mall? Were they the intended addressee? Or did they perhaps imagine that they would be perceived as having asked the question, and were they nervous about receiving the response?
Or had the Council invented an intended addressee, and was their imagination now filled with the risk of a congregation of people gathering in public space in the forecourt of their civic centre, who is the Council's public? The hoarding in Little Mallet Street, where the text was installed, remains blank at the time of writing, and Council have since admitted that they are forced to regularly repaint it back to grey as it attracts ongoing vandalism.
It is not the intention of this reflective essay to paint our, or indeed any local council, as public arts enemy. Rather, we see them here as funders of the project, as enablers, as audience, and as provocateurs, as makers and curators of public art as a diffractive civic conversation. Feasibility Study was not conceived as a deliberate agitation, protest, or even commentary on civic governance, but neither was it conceived purely as reflection. These works are public conversations, conversations in public space, works of publishing, and meaningful acts of making public. They are diffractive, dialogical, collaborative, and at their core, democratic. They ask for imaginative response, civic self-reflection, and participation in the broadest sense. They ask that they take space for citizens to understand themselves better in the context of their public space. This includes government at every level, but especially the local.
During his informal architecture tour of Geelong CBD, Jose pointed out a curve in the first floor facade on the back side of Market Square. That was a street. The four of us stood staring at the loading dock, where two roof lines, one old and one new, met awkwardly. It was a street. In that moment, there was suddenly possibility. The shadowy back alley doesn't have to be the way it is. There is still a way through. This is the feeling at the core of civic agency. Public art, as participatory experiment, is an opportunity to imagine collectively how things have been and can be different, how public space can be shifted. It champions diffractive and situated knowledge production as performative making. It is a tool for making meaning.
We haven't heard from Geelong City Council about the remaining 5 texts that sit rolled up in cardboard boxes, including one designed for Little Mallet Street that says, where the building curves, it would have been an arcade or maybe even a street. It remains unclear how successful this work has been to its funder and how useful it would be to continue to install texts for immediate removal. But in the spirit of expanded field and feasibility study, the Contemporary continues to imagine. Imagine a conversation between members of council in which they ask each other, why is it that a young person meeting friends in the bus mall would understand themselves as loitering? This is a question that public art can ask.